Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our session on human behavior, essentially behavioral science in a time of rapidly changing AI. Today's discussion will focus on how AI is shaping not only the way we work, but how we make decisions overall. More specifically, not the technical capabilities of artificial intelligence, but how people actually understand and use it. And it's this interaction between humans and the tech that really drives both the benefits and risks. So we'll get into this with our speakers today. Before we do that, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Mary McLennan. I lead what's called the UN Behavioral Science Group in the UN Innovation Network. We bring together over 8,000 colleagues from more than 70 entities in 150 countries. So lots of interest in behavioral science. And we also have a group discussing behavioral science and AI. So we'll put some of those links in the chat for you shortly. All right, before we get into today's session, I did want to start with a few polls to figure out who's with us today and how we can maybe the previous slide, that would be great. How we can tailor this conversation to all of you. So I'm going to launch the first poll, which is in your professional context. So in your work environment, how would you describe current AI use? Would you say that it's widely adopted and embedded in many workflows? People are using it pretty systematically and regularly? Or would you say it's used by individuals, but not quite institutionalized, institutionally integrated just yet? So maybe there are some pockets and interests, but not quite fully there. Are you at kind of the experimentation stage with pilots and testing and some overall curiosity? Or is it rarely used and it's kind of really at the very early stages? Or are you just not sure? That's fine as well. Okay, and then we have another. Okay, well, we have both the questions actually at once now. So we're seeing a lot of colleagues looking at it being used by individuals, but not quite integrated just yet. So I think that's kind of where we'd expect a lot of people to be. There are some early adopters which have more wide engagement, but really most colleagues are looking at the individuals are using it, but not quite institutionally organized, institutionally integrated. Okay, and our second question here is, which risks do you think is more likely in your organization over the next 12 months? Do you think we're moving a bit too fast? Maybe more safeguards would be needed. Maybe there's some challenges or risks that we're not seeing that we might see down the track. Or do you think it's moving too slowly and we're missing out on opportunities to have impact and do meaningful work that maybe we're not able to engage with just yet? Or do you think it's equally? I mean, there's very much a situation where it could be moving too fast in some spaces, too slowly in other spaces, and what that could look like. Or are you unsure? So here we see colleagues saying it's pretty split. I mean, people are saying that it can be moving too fast in some spaces, a little bit fewer people saying we're missing out on opportunities, a lot of colleagues saying it both equally. So lots there to think about as well. So maybe our speakers can keep that in mind as we go. A lot of colleagues are saying individuals are using it, but not quite institutions, and kind of split in terms of whether we're going too fast or too slowly with our adoption overall. Okay, so thank you for engaging in the poll. Oh, sorry, share results for you all to see, so you can see the results of the poll overall for that. Okay, so now on to the next slide would be great. So the way we're going to run this session is there'll be opportunities to engage with our speakers because there are so many of you. What we're going to be doing is using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. So I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. And there you can also upvote the questions of your colleagues to ensure that we have a conversation that reflects what everyone would like to speak about today. And for our conversation today, we're focusing on the themes of behavioral science and policy, not on other areas as well. This is very much meant to be a behavioral science and a policy conversation. Okay, so with that, over to our speakers. We're very fortunate to have with us three speakers who range in experience from frontier AI to academia to on-the-ground behavioral science work. So just in alphabetical order here, we have first Avital Balwit, who's the CEO, the Chief of Staff to the CEO of Anthropic, Dario Amodei, who's a eminent figure in the AI community, to say the least. And she said she's been with Anthropic for 3 years, which is a lifetime in the AI world. So very fortunate to have her with us. She works at the intersection of frontier AI, organizational strategy, responsible deployment. In addition to her work with Anthropic, she's also been a researcher in this space and has done some really interesting creative writing as a complement to our work, to our discussion today. We'll also hear from Alex Imus, who's a professor of behavioral science, economics, and applied AI at the University of Chicago, the Booth School, a well-known institution when it comes to behavioral science. His work has involved studying decision-making under risk and uncertainty and incentives, how incentives shape behavior over a number of years. And more recently, he's focused a lot more on AI and economics, and particularly some of the behavioral elements. He has a very interesting Substack on this if you want to know more. It's called The Ghost of Electricity. And he's recently published a book on behavioral economics with Professor Richard Thaler, who's won a Nobel Prize for his work in the space, if you want to know more about his work. And then finally, we have with us Josh Martin, who is a behavioral scientist with UNICEF and well known in the behavioral science community over the last decade plus, doing a lot of work on the ground in particularly lower resource setting and complex contexts, particularly in peace and security environments. And he now is focusing more on AI too in his work and how we might be able to leverage that from a behavioral science angle. So with that, over to our speakers. If you want to stop screen sharing, that'd be great. And if our speakers can turn their cameras on. My first question to all of you, maybe we'll start with Alex, is from your perspective, how are you seeing the shape and pace of AI progress from what's being done in practice today? And what are some of the key risks we should perhaps be paying attention to?
Thanks a lot, Mary. I'm really glad to be here. So I think what we're seeing is the data tells us that AI is just, as far as technologies go, it's been a completely unprecedented level of adoption. I mean, you see this curve starting in like 2023. Before that, nobody was using AI really. I mean, other than algorithms when you're watching Netflix or something like that. And then this technology with the beginning of ChatGPT and then Anthropic, and now Claude is number one app in the App Store. You see just a complete vertical line as far as adoption, the fastest adoption of technology of all time. We've seen over those years just completely huge advances in the underlying models, and Avital will speak more about this, coming from Anthropic and being responsible for that huge advance in capability. So the thing that I wanted to say about that adoption and particularly the behavioral science of that adoption is that it's been very uneven. So even though many people are adopting it, adoption is lumpy. It's not like you look into a company and every single person is using AI in the same way. People are using AI to different extents. Some not using it at all. Other people are using it poorly, kind of using the free, like bad, like at this point, outdated model. Other people are paying money. They know how to use it. They know what to use it. And this lumpy adoption, the reason that we should be worried about this is that adoption is highly correlated with people with advantages that people already had. So people who are highly skilled, who have higher income. This goes within organizations, within country, and also between countries. So if you look at a poor country, there's different levels of adoption and lower levels of adoption than richer countries. So this sort of lumpy adoption has this behavioral science angle of thinking about what is people's mental model, what is their motivation to adopt these models in the first place. And this is a worry because you might get into a situation where AI is going to be kind of leveling people up in terms of their productivity, and that's going to generate more inequality unless adoption is more uniform. As far as potential risks from AI, I think it's a double-edged sword. You have the potential risks from agentic AI with agents generating, slop and misinformation. But on the other hand, you have the flip side of that with agents also being able to kind of protect people when these agents are personal and aligned to their users, where these agents could be basically the protector, these guardian agents, as we like to call in our research, where there's a harness that each individual has to actually prevent slop and misinformation from being consumed, and also aligning people's decisions with their preferences. So there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of very fast adoption and moving and speed, but at the same time, there's risks to think about as well.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Alex. Lots to unpack there from a behavioral perspective, but also from a more general perspective. I like the idea of guardian agents and how we can really start to think about how we can make this technology so fit for purpose to improve some of the issues we're really working on in the UN intensely today. Okay, so with that, over to Avital. How are you seeing the pace and how AI progress is looking, and what are some of the risks we might be looking at this point in time?
Awesome. So first, just plus one to everything Alex said. And adding on to that, so because we're talking to an interdisciplinary audience, I want to back up and talk about what I mean when I'm talking about AI and sort of the AI that's gotten the most focus over the past couple of years. At Anthropic, we make Claude, and Claude is a large language model, which is also what ChatGPT and Gemini is. And the key thing to understand about these systems is that they're very general purpose. It's one model that can write code, that can analyze data, that can make hypotheses, draft prose. These are not sort of like past more narrow AI systems like protein prediction models or spam filters or things that people are using at quantitative trading firms. They're very general. And at a very simplistic level, these models take in a huge corpus of text, something like the whole internet plus other specialized data sources plus some extra training, and they learn how to predict the next token. And from that, actually, this generalizes in a bunch of interesting way. Like somehow that also allows them to write code, do math, play chess, even. And something I hear from people who don't work in AI occasionally is they say, oh, these models are just predicting the next token. And I think that while that is both technically true, it's kind of like saying humans are just atoms. It doesn't actually help you sort of understand what humans can do. And so I think that it's better, like if you look at these models and you see what types of problems they can solve and sort of how they go about solving them, it looks a lot like reasoning. And I would say that whether or not, like philosophically, we want to have that debate, using that phrase actually will help you understand what the models can do better. And so two other concepts worth knowing is now we actually do talk about reasoning models, and these are models that actually take a bit more time to answer your question. They spend more computing power on that answer. They're actually using like a little virtual scratch pad, and it's much more like system two thinking versus system one thinking. And then also people now talk about agentic AI. So in the past, AI was much more like a chatbot, like you ask it a question, it gives you an answer. But now AI systems, if you connect them to tools and give them permissions, they can actually take actions in the world. And so Claude is both a reasoning model and can be used in an agentic way. Okay, so back to the pace of progress. Like Alex said, the pace of progress is very, very fast. And so back in 2019, the Anthropic co-founders were still at OpenAI and they were working on GPT-2. And people were really excited about GPT-2. And why were they excited? They were excited because it could make kind of coherent sentences, like sort of elementary school level sentences. Flash forward a few years, and now models are acing the bar exam. They're acing the medical licensing exam. They're able to pass sort of PhD knowledge level benchmarks. And it's not just benchmarks, they're being really widely deployed in the world, in everywhere from we're seeing people using them in financial services, in education, in pharma companies, in healthcare. And they're world class at translation. They're being widely deployed with nonprofits as well. So you're seeing not just benchmarks, but also sort of real world impact. Like this year, I think a model finally got the gold medal in the international math competition. They're able to now sort of work on a coding project for like 30 hours. And so again, that's 2026. And in 2019, barely able to write sentences. Um, okay, so like any powerful technology, is this just upside? Unfortunately, it is not. And so there are unfortunately many risks to worry about. There are sort of the more near-term risks, like AI makes it easy, it democratizes access to knowledge. And this can be wonderful when it's directed at good purposes. It can also be scary when it's directed at bad purposes. And so misuse is a real risk. Like something that I think we've sort of relied on is that criminals or terrorists are not always world experts at what they're trying to do, which is great. Like we haven't seen a very successful wide scale bio attack. AI without proper guardrails could be used for something like that. It could also be used for more sophisticated or widespread fraud. It could be used for cyber attacks. And so these are all things that you can counteract with guardrails, but if you don't, it's just democratizing access to things that are scary or bad. Um, Also, there's risks from like authoritarians using AI for surveillance or suppression of their own people or aggressive actions on the world stage. And then there's also risks from even if AI is just really successful, but it has large employment effects, that's something that we need to consider, making sure that people are set up to succeed and can have dignity if this impacts employment. And then there are also the sort of weird risks, but are still worth mentioning, which is that like we're building something very powerful and very smart that we don't fully understand. And we want to make sure that people can sort of retain appropriate control over those systems.
Great. Thank you so much, Avital, for that really comprehensive context in terms of where we've come from the last, only since 2019, lots of likes and hearts for that. I love like you also talked about the how the reasoning is and how it works, and threw in some of the behavioral science concepts there about system one and system two. But also it gets me thinking like Anthropic's published so much on this topic, especially the CEO. So I'd be curious. I might just put in the chat some of the essays from your CEO Dario Amodei, because I think that really would help to outline some of that a bit more. But thank you so much for that. Okay, so next over to Josh. How are you seeing the pace within your work at UNICEF and outside from the UN International Development angle? And what are some of the risks you're seeing?
Thanks so much. So it's great to be here with everyone, and I would agree to everything that's been said so far. As someone who works in the sort of international development community, I am a sort of in-house scientist for a large group of country offices at UNICEF who are trying to improve development outcomes through helping people make better decisions and take better actions. As part of the social and behavior change work that UNICEF is in part really known for. And I have to say, in that role, I see really a full spectrum for how people are using AI at the country level on the frontier of development, both in terms of the beneficiaries of people who live in countries and benefit from development programs, and are on the frontier of helping their country develop economically, and from the side of the actual employees of this system who have to navigate the rollout of new technology in order to do their work as effectively as possible. I mean, I see everything from raw output from ChatGPT and Claude, sometimes with emojis stuck in, which I think is to me a clear signal that people are using these tools, at least occasionally, in rather clumsy and poorly thought through ways. To, on the other hand, extremely highly discerning and careful uses of the technology to solve particular problems that are complementary to the work that they would otherwise do, and really increasing value for the international development system. And so, there's a really a full spectrum. I mean, for me, I do a lot of work on sort of the research of how people can more effectively use AI. And right now we're still very much at the beginning of this literature. It has to be said. I mean, this is we've heard that generative AI as a consumer product is really only a few years old. Models, of course, are constantly improving. We're now at the point where we can do so much more, as Avital said, than we could even a couple of years ago. But even in the last couple of years of empirical literature, of studies that are trying to identify the sort of causal effect of using AI in a workplace setting, you see a couple of things. One is that you have to be very careful about the kinds of tasks that you give it. If you want it to do something for you, you really have to make sure that what you want it to do for you is something that is going to complement the value that you are bringing to the table as a professional, and not substituting for it. I think it's very tempting for people to want to say, AI can sort of help me increase my output, but that increase in output is coming at the expense of something that really you might do intrinsically very, very well. And that's not just a risk to you as a professional, it's a risk to the quality of the work that you do, and inevitably also to the reputation and the quality of the institution and its work that you're participating in. So I think it's very careful that it's very important that people be careful about what they ask it to do, and that those tasks, generally tend to be most effective when they are things that are lower down in the hierarchy of sort of cognitive labor. But not always. We've heard, of course, that AI can solve very complicated math problems and can win medals in math competitions and things like that. And so, of course, AI is extremely valuable as a decision tool, as a cognitive support as well. But even then, when you're asking it to think for you, you have to perhaps be even more careful about how exactly what thinking tasks you ask it to do. There's a whole now subset of literature, some of which has been done at Anthropic, but also at the other AI labs, that identifies, people use different words for it, but one of the terms people use is cognitive surrender, which is this idea that the more and more you use it to think for you, it has a blunting effect on your own cognition, on the skills that you bring to the table, and it might even decrease the value of the output that you are producing in aggregate. And so you have to be really careful about what it does for you and how it thinks for you. And there's lots of nuance to what we're finding in the actual academic literature on both of those topics. And so I think for me the biggest sort of near-term risk, I agree with what Avital has said about the long-term risk. I completely sign up for that. But I think there is also a nearer-term risk that we see a sort of erosion a little bit of skill and also of effectiveness in frontline industries that are critical really for not just producing social and public goods, but in helping advance society overall, including in the international development sector. And my final point on this would just be that the benefits of AI are already very unevenly distributed in across the world, and particularly in developing countries that haven't made investments, haven't been able to make investments in digital infrastructure over the last 10 years. And I think you see that gap really clearly in the region that I work most intensively in, which is the Middle East. You have Gulf countries that are really at the very top of AI adoption right now across the world, with more than 60% of working age professionals, for instance, in the UAE who are using AI on a regular basis. And you compare that to 10% or 15% in large countries in the same region like Egypt. And really the difference there is it's not just a story about income, it's also a story about the investments in digital infrastructure that those countries have made. So we should be mindful that these risks, are sort of they come along with AI diffusion and they may even come along with AI diffusion that's too quick and too fast, too rapid, too uncontrolled. But AI itself has a long way to go in order to sort of fully diffuse in each of these areas similarly.
Great, thanks so much for that, Josh, for highlighting the differences, especially around the world. Some colleagues are already asking some questions about that and what this means in the global international context. So from what I'm hearing across all of you, we're seeing that AI is happening, really progressing really quickly in the matter of years where we've come from. Not unevenly, both in terms of different types of AI, but also globally around the world. Do you have any comments or questions for each other? Any things you'd like to say? What other panelists have spoken about? No, that's fine as well. If not, no. I feel like there's a lot of agreement already, but we can keep going. Okay. Okay, so then on to my next question for all of you. I have many questions for all of you, but if you wanted to speak with each other, I would give you the chance.
Yeah, I have a question
Yeah, go
if I'm
for it,
allowed,
Josh.
Mary, if we have time. I'm curious, for Avital in particular, one thing that I've seen is I've seen the Frontier AI Labs take over the course of the last year a lot more responsibility for not just how the models behave, but how they're used in the marketplace. I'd love to hear a little bit about like Anthropic's perspective on this, because, for instance, Anthropic has always had, I think one of the leading societal impacts teams in the field, but we've also seen the scope of that work expand greatly. We've seen the evals that are being, published on model cards also, become way more extensive in terms of the issues and risks that they cover as well. So just would love to know like how Anthropic thinks about the degree of responsibility it takes for usership as opposed to simply just, the quality of the tech itself.
I think like because in some sense we like live in the future, there's a lot of responsibility for that. Like San Francisco and especially the iLabs in some sense, like they just get to see a little bit ahead and they get that technology first because they're building it. And so it feels like there's a responsibility to make sure that that information filters out to the world so that there can be a public conversation about it, so that policymakers can create sensible policies around it. And because we use it so much, we can also report on like what we're finding with our own people, like how much is it augmenting people versus automating them? Like, how do people feel about that? As you talk about skills, like how are people keeping their skills alive as they delegate some tasks to AI? And so that's why one of the reasons we have a societal impacts team is we can sort of get that information out early. And yes, from the very beginning, Anthropic has been really excited about transparency and transparency, especially around safety testing. And so I think our last model card, which is this big sort of report card or like label almost that you release alongside any model, it was 200 pages. And I was like, oh my gosh, guys, really? Like this is longer than ever has been before. But I think it's great just to run a bunch of tests, to tell people what tests you ran, to tell them how your model did on those tests. And it's very informative for people to choose as they think about what model do I feel comfortable using for my staff to use, for my children to use, and for policymakers to look at these tests and think, hey, are any of these giving us really good signal? Are these things that we should require people to run? And so I think that model cards are very good, and we're still iterating on evaluations. I think because AI moves so fast, you make an evaluation and then it gets saturated, so you have to make a new one. But I think that the science of evaluations and being very transparent about your evaluations is a very powerful policy tool.
Sounds it's very much related to behavioral science as well, to the evaluations of what we're looking at in the real world. I did put in the chat the model card links, Avital, so that people can check those out if they want to read further. Alex, did you want to comment on anything discussed now or? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just as far as the responsibility that the AI companies are taking for use is great to see. And but at the same time, there's a lot of heterogeneity there. So as Josh mentioned, Anthropic is one of the leaders of that responsibility space, but there are other models that are very, very, very capable that are being released without almost without model cards. So this is a space where I think that policymakers really need to start thinking about, as far as recommending models, as far as giving harnesses to how people are using the models. It's not every model is not created equal. So Avital already talked about the difference between reasoning versus non-reasoning models. There's also, safer models versus less safe models. So the models with 200-page cards are safer. They've been evaluated more, and you could see this. I do my own testing, and I'm an independent researcher. I'm at a university, so I do my own testing. I have my own lab for those sorts of things. And there's very dangerous things that you can ask models, and some models will do it, and other ones will say no. And that's extremely important to document and to note and get out there. And this is something, we're talking at the UN. I'm talking to an audience of policymakers and people who are thinking about policy, thinking about differences in models, both between labs and within each lab, different types of, code. We have coding agents, we have web-based LLMs. This is on your plate in order to guide your employees and to guide the people under you and guide the communities that you're serving, as far as if your goal is to enact kind of human flourishing from AI. These are just number one concerns to be thinking about.
Thanks, Alice. It's super helpful to articulate, and it relates back to where a lot of colleagues are. They're at the individual use; they're not quite the systematic use just yet. So now is exactly the time to be thinking about, which models we use, how we use them, how we're leveraging them overall. And I promised earlier I'd put Dario Amadei's essays in the chat. I think he touches upon a lot of these topics there too. So I just put those in there now. Um, great. Okay, so lots of questions coming in the Q&A as well, which is great to see. If you would like to check them out, you can also upvote the questions of your colleagues. So I encourage you to check them out. We'll have time for Q&A with those shortly. But I have another question for our speakers before we get to those. Um, um, Thinking about now going towards the future. So what does a truly good AI future look like in the best case? What kind of behavioral interventions or policy ideas might seem most promising if we're going in that direction as well? So let's start with you, Alex, again, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
So I want to piggyback on Josh's point about complementarity. So I think the way that AI leads to human flourishing, is at least in the way the systems are now. I don't like making forecasts as the ground is literally moving under my feet. But I'm willing to make a forecast in the near term, which is that the way to use AI for human flourishing and for people to use it effectively is as a complement, not as a substitute. And what that means is that you have skills that you're really good at, why you were hired in the first place. Don't use AI to replace those skills in a way that you de-skill and potentially are generating a worse product. So, for example, as Josh said, you're getting a lot of emails with like smiley faces and clearly written by AI. People will judge you based on that. They're getting a worse product. You're going to be, and things like that. But at the same time, AI can hugely increase your productivity in other domains. So as far as doing like brainstorming with AI, as far as doing like checklists, coding, a lot of these sorts of tasks, learning how to use it as a complement is just going to lead to a huge productivity boost. Now, where is the behavioral science in this? The behavioral science is the fact that many people just don't know how to use these systems. They don't know the difference between reasoning and non-reasoning models. They don't know the difference between Grok and Anthropic for what these models are good for. And so the behavioral science comes from leadership creating both encouraging people around them to use these and experiment, but also guidance and actual training on how to be using these sorts of models. So we see these there was a recent 2025 BCG survey of all like a large survey of employees and employers. Where are employers using this to increase their productivity without de-skilling? Where are they optimistic about using AI? Where are they using it effectively? In the organizations where leadership is providing top-down guidance, providing training, telling them what models to use and how. And this gets us back to this lumpy adoption question. In order to get the sort of equalizing effects of AI, where the people who are potentially kind of lower are behind actually get a leg up, where we see less inequality, is to have more and more uniform adoption. How do you do that? It's through behavioral science and top-down guidance.
Great, thanks for that, Alex. There's a lot there we can think about in a big bureaucracy that is the UN and how we reflect upon those notions and ideas. Okay, next over to Avital. What's your take on this topic and what the future could look like and where we're heading?
I think the best case for AI is really, really good. So much so that I don't want to start there because I think it'll sound a bit sci-fi. But I would encourage folks, if you're interested in seeing a positive future for AI, reading Dario's essay, Machines of Loving Grace. But I think something that's nearer in is a situation where everyone has a fleet of like world-class advisors on demand. Like think like a brilliant doctor, lawyer, tutor, counselor, research assistant. Like for some of us who are wealthier or in sort of wealthier countries, that might not sound that crazy. But many of you thinking about access, that list of things is wildly outside the reach of most people. And so thinking about having that at near zero cost in any language on demand and what that could unlock for people. Another sort of concrete thing that we're already beginning to see is scientific acceleration. So new drugs, new treatments. If you think about things like sort of CRISPR or mRNA vaccines, those were breakthroughs that very, very smart people made. And if you had sort of millions of Nobel Prize tier researchers working on new discoveries, you would get more treatments like that. Maybe we would get cures to Alzheimer's, to cancers, a really good malaria vaccine. So there are so many things that we think that AI could unlock. And it's not just sort of the more like sexy parts of the process, but also the paperwork, the grant applications, the FDA applications. We're already seeing Claude partner with scientists to make those things happen much faster. And so I think that you have a world where you could have far healthier people. You could bring down the costs of these treatments. You could distribute them more widely. And also, I think AI will produce a lot of economic growth. That does, of course, leave open the question of distribution, which is a very important question as well. But sort of the best case scenario is people who are more empowered, they have expertise at their fingertips, they're healthier, and they're wealthier. Sadly, of course, this future does not just happen by default. The same technology that could democratize access could also erode agency. It could be captured by bad actors. It could concentrate power. And the difference between these is sort of policy choices and design choices. So I can speak a little bit about that. I already talked about transparency around model cards and model evaluations, which I think is important and part of it. I'm also excited about transparency around something called model specs or constitutions. And this is basically the set of values that you train your model on. And so when people say like, what values do the AI systems have? I think that's a very reasonable question for people to ask and be interested in. And so recently Anthropic published our constitution. It's like a 70-page document that's all natural language. You guys can read it. You can see what the principles are. And we did that so that people can understand them and argue about them and tell us if we missed something. And we're in conversations with a bunch of people. One group we're talking with a lot is faith leaders because they've obviously thought a lot about what is the good life? How should we treat each other? But I think that publishing these constitutions both gives people information, but also puts good pressure on these companies to do something reasonable there. And to be clear, I do not think that transparency is sufficient. I think that's sort of the floor. Like you need transparency so that the public and policymakers can figure out what else they want. But I don't think that it should be like, oh, AI labs have been transparent. That's simply enough. They should now do what they want. But I think transparency is a very important starting place, and it can generate information that can lead to good lawmaking. On the design front, I think that there are ways you can build the systems so that they help sort of protect human agency. So I really love teaching mode. There's a mode that you can go into on Claude and on several of the other systems where you want the AI to teach you how to do something, but not just do it for you. And I think especially for younger people that are interacting with AI systems, you want them to be able to interact with an AI system in that mode. So it can say, hey, I realize it seems like we're working on your homework together, but maybe you want me to help you with your homework, not do your homework for you. And I think that's a meaningfully different mode for them to interact with it in. I also think it's good for models to notice over-reliance. Like you could build the model such, and we're actually working on this, so that the model, say you're having a really long conversation with it, it can sort of gently say at some point, maybe you want to go talk to a friend about this. Maybe you want to go talk to a loved one. Maybe you want to get offline and go outside for a while. And I think that's really good to not generate sort of that over reliance or unhealthy relationships. And then, of course, there are some really cut and dry things that everyone should be doing, and a lot of folks are, which is like if you're having a conversation where there's like self harm topics coming up, that model should be able to immediately direct you to sort of relevant resources in your area so that you can get that help. Or say you're asking about information around elections, it should be able to direct you to very verified, validated sources in your area to get you that information. So the best model of AI, I believe, I think both my panelists mentioned this earlier, is sort of this like genuinely sort of like disinterested advisor. Like they just want what's best for you. The AI doesn't have its own agenda. It's just trying to like authentically work for you to help you to be like your best reflective self. And so I think there are both sort of policy choices and design choices that I'd be really excited to see people pursue in that area.
Thank you so much, Avatar. There's so much there to unpack from the different angles. But I will say, a question we often get in the UN about the transparency side is trying to use these models and understand what it is. I do very much heard from colleagues very agree. It's the floor to understand how to use them and then how to go forward from there. But also, I believe the Constitution actually included some understanding from the UN along the way when you were developing it. I believe you looked at the UN Charter when you were putting some of the thinking together, which I think would resonate well with colleagues. Is that correct? Do you?
Yeah, our first constitution, we just actually put the UN Charter in as one of the aspects, and so now those principles are still reflected, but sort of in our own words. But we were looking for a source of sort of universal values to make sure that Claude was reflecting that, and so that's our original constitution. It was one of the first blog posts I worked
Mhm.
on at Anthropic, talking about that.
Good to hear. I mean, you're getting lots of hearts and legs, so definitely, I think that's worth noting for sure. Okay, next, Josh, over to you. How are you seeing the future where we're going? And yeah, what's your take?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the barriers right now to try to answer that question is just that it's so hard to imagine what the future could look like in the case of this particular technological rollout, which is so different from any other tech wave, right? I mean, in some sense, maybe it isn't in the sense that, like, if you imagine, what it would have been like to be, a farmer or something, or, before the Industrial Revolution, could you have imagined what your life would have been like, after, mechanized agriculture and railways and, machinery and everything, and urbanization and everything that came with that? And of course the answer is no. And we're living in of some version of that now. It's just so compressed into this very such a shorter timeline. And so, when we say, like, what are the best possible futures? I mean, the cone of possibility is just so wide. And, from a behavioral science perspective, one thing we know about how people sort of imagine is that it's actually very difficult to imagine what's on the other side of a very thick wall, right? I mean, and actually AI has helped create sort of simulations of what you look like when you're older, for instance, as a way to get people to do things like save more for retirement, because it sort of helps you connect that gap between where the world is going and where you are now in a way that might prompt different types of decision making and action taking. And so I just think that the fact that things are moving so quickly and towards some endpoint, which I think is quite far from where we are now, makes it all that much harder to be able to adjust in the short term. I read something yesterday actually that hit me quite hard, which is sort of targeting the community of us who are working on sort of empirically trying to understand what we can do as researchers right now, and what the article is. It's a comment in Nature by Daniel Bjorkregan from December, and what he was saying effectively is that the research methods we're using for today won't ever give us the answer for how AI is going to change our workplaces in the future, which is sort of very disheartening to hear as someone who's actually doing that research in real time. But one of the techniques that he suggested is that we use research methods that are sort of forcing people to imagine entirely different ways of interacting that don't currently exist. So, for instance, imagine if you told people that, I mean, right now AI is already very close to approximating human capacity in many domains, but imagine in some area where it wasn't, you actually had a human sort of being the AI in a way that test subjects wouldn't be able to notice. And so you're sort of asking them, and you're observing how they respond and react to something which really is a human, but they think is an AI, as a way to get them to imagine what it would look like to live their life in the presence of something which actually does replace human interaction, because that certainly is the future that we're heading towards. So all that to say that I don't think we can imagine right now what our life will look like. And I think, like what do we do about that is is a different question. But I would just say, like, a lot of the development interventions that I've worked on in my career have sort of had this character to them where we're trying to help support people's decision making by giving people, a scaffolded sort of decision making algorithm, right? We're trying to, for instance, help cash transfer beneficiaries in Madagascar make decisions about whether they should save or spend the resources that they're getting through these government assistance programs. And we're trying to give them sort of tools for helping them make plans and then stick to those plans, as a way to help them achieve better outcomes for themselves. And AI has come along and completely, washed all that away. I mean, AI can be, can be that system. It can serve that goal. And so there are huge benefits to be harvested, even in the short term. We don't have to, imagine too far in the future to see what those benefits could be. But in the future, though, what we're seeing is that those mechanisms for supporting decision making are coming closer and closer to what we think of as our true self, with real implications for how we define the human condition. Just as an example, there's a team at the MIT Media Lab who are working on. They have a paper on AI as an inner voice, which is basically developing ways that you could have AI sort of passively listen to your conversations, observe your behavior as you go about your daily routine, and sort of whisper nudges in your ear, and get you to sort of think about things that you haven't even thought about. And this is very different, right, from the decision-making algorithms I was describing before. I mean, here you have a system which is sort of prompting you, almost uninvited, to change how you behave. And we have to really think about behavioral science in a different way. As behavioral, just one final comment on this is that as behavioral scientists, we've always had, a set of principles that guide how we intervene in decision making. And the bedrock of that has been consultation. We want people to be bought into how they're inviting these decision support systems into their lives. And now AI is able to sort of shortcut that by being part of our passive environment. And that will have real implications for the future, for how we think of as the parts of our life, with the walls between the parts of our life that we want to take full responsibility for and those that we know we need help with, that those are being erased. And so, how we have to really struggle to imagine what's on the other side of that. And I don't think we're currently doing as good a job as we could be, but maybe this is a call for more of that sort of frontline and new types of research that will help get us there.
Great, thanks for that, Josh. Super, super helpful in terms of first envisioning the future. I think this is something that often, because behavioral science is so multi-interdisciplinary, it's so interesting how we're talking from philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology. It's hard to see, but I think there's some ways maybe behavioral science can add value there. And also the changing of research methods. That's a huge topic. I know Alex has written and done a lot on that too, and how we do research in this time of all the changes means a lot for the behavioral science space. So thank you for that. Again, lots of hearts and likes. So I should say, I did put in the chat, Avital, the Constitution, so colleagues can look at that. Alex, I'll put I think you put you put your Substack, but I'll put that now too again. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to
Yeah.
go back to Avital's point about so they released a really nice blog post about how AI is used in education. And
Mm,
I think going to kind of thinking about this teaching mode in Claude, how we already have a pretty good idea of how current systems are being used in education from the research that they've already done. And some of it has been kind of like working with it creatively and things like that. But you see a lot of just people asking for answers and kind of offloading learning and cognitive development and human capital development to these tools. And I think that's why I put in a Substack. I wrote a blog post kind of synthesizing that literature about how people use AI, both in education and other types of settings. And I think this is where kind of things like teaching mode become really, really important. There's a PNAS paper by Hamza Bastani and showing that essentially if you just use AI without guardrails in education, people do really, really well on exams when they have access to AI. Once that AI is gone, they do much worse than those that did not have access to AI. But at the same time, the paper shows that if you have teaching mode AI or whatever that looks like, you get the opposite. They both do better while using AI, and they retain the knowledge better, and they do better on those exams when AI is removed. So this sort of scaffolding for how these systems are implemented in practice, and particularly, we're talking about behavioral science, defaults matter. And defaults matter for as far as what is the first thing I see when I open that Claude window? Is it in teaching mode or is it the other version. And I think these are exactly the types of kind of lighter touch interventions that we should be thinking about. And just to touch on what quickly on what Josh was saying, we have some research now coming out on again what we're calling guardian agents. What will interactions look like when a lot of the interactions that we see in the economy and between individuals are through their agents? Well, it turns out if you can program your agent as far as having your personal agent, what sort of values do you give that agent when it's interacting with the world? It turns out that you see these sorts of old school behavioral economic effects where people want the agent to be more patient, they want them to be less loss averse, they want them to be nicer, they want to imbue their agent with the sort of values that they would like for themselves to have, but system one prevents them from actually developing. And so thinking about kind of a positive vision, one positive vision is when when you kind of offload interactions to an aligned agent in some ways, you might get better outcomes for the individuals that have these aligned agents.
Thanks for that, Alex. There's so much in there to so we'll check out what you shared in Substack. That's great about the education sort of teaching mode versus other modes, and a lot to unpack with agents. That's really interesting. It sounds like we should have another session on just specifically agents and behavioral science. I think there's so much there to think about. Okay, Avital, Josh, did you want to comment on anything? Did you want to respond? You're good. Okay, so we have lots of questions coming through, over 30 of them. I see some of them were in the chat as well. So if you want to put whatever questions you have into the Q&A box, then we can see them. As you can see, colleagues are asking for resources. So yes, Alex, if you can comment there, that's great. Okay, so one of the first questions, the one that's highly voted, it's a bit more general. It goes back to, I guess, the beginning. So we are at the UN here. We have colleagues from doing all different walks of life, different things. But when it comes to the UN overall and what's needed in the UN to take better advantage of AI, what would you say? What are some recommendations you would have for the UN more generally in terms of how we can take this forward? So I don't know who wants to start with that. I see Avital nodding. Yep, go for it.
Because as we were going through questions for this panel, there was a question about where are you worried about under or over reliance on AI, and my sort of surprising answer might be that I tend to see places like the UN under deploy rather than over deploy because you folks are so thoughtful, you're so cautious, you really don't want to mess this up. And I'd say actually, if you're not putting the AI in charge of like important irreversible decisions, then you're probably underusing it. Like in the sense of like, don't put it there. But if you're using it to consult you, if you're using it to support you, you should be trying that. Like you are, of course, responsible for the ultimate outputs of that system in the same way that you'd be responsible for the work of someone who like you were managing. Like you should look over those answers. You should own those answers. You should make sure they're high quality. But it can support you in your work already in all sorts of ways. And I think it would be a really sad world if you see like quantitative trading funds and consulting firms fully leveraging AI, making themselves super productive, and you don't see it leveraged in places that have these really important missions. Like we do see some nonprofit deployment, some educational deployment. We offer discounts for those folks, and I just think that that is the place you want to see accelerated the most. And so I'd encourage everyone here, if you're not trying it, do try it. Don't put it in charge of those very important irreversible decisions. You don't need to give it access to all your tools and have it out there taking actions for you. But as a support system, as like a sort of chief of staff to you, it is fully capable of that. And I would love to see all of you leveraging it.
I hope we'll have some more case studies to share with you next time, Avatar. Okay, Alex, Josh, what's your take on what the UN should be doing differently, perhaps?
I think I just echo Avital there. It's important for everybody to just experiment. I get this question all the time from students, from CS professors at the University of Chicago. How should I be using AI? And I mean, my answer is use the best model that you can get your hands on. That's number one. That's going to be really important. A lot of the conversations I have, it's like, these are just next token predictors. They hallucinate all the time. That's probably because you're using a very outdated model. Using a frontier model from Anthropic, OpenAI, it's just a completely different experience. So I think just experimenting and trying it yourself is going to be really, really important. And I mean, it's really sad to see, the US State Department or other federal government facilities and the UN and things like that, you hear what they're using. They're using like ChatGPT 4.1 or something like that. Whereas, my undergrads at University of Chicago are using Opus 4.6. That that should be reversed. We want the best tools for our most important decision makers. And I really can't stress that enough. It's not just the fact that these are more capable tools, they're also safer. They have more guardrails. They're more reliable. All of these sort of things have been improved in these models over time. So we really want for people to experiment widely, to get that adoption to be less lumpy, and to be using the best models. And that's particularly true at the UN.
Thanks for that, Alex. Josh, you have some thoughts on the reality of working at the UN and how you're finding things?
Too many. I think maybe just to be just really concise about one thing I think that UN folks can do. One very salient feature of working in the UN system is report writing, right? I think anyone on this call who works in the system will agree. There's a lot of sort of obligatory writing which is required in official documents, and I think one of the sort of best possibilities for an AI future would be really just reducing all of that effectively written noise to salient talking points that are actually useful. Which is not to say we should have AI write the talking points. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think I would encourage everyone to really think about what you want to convey through your writing and put that down first. And then, if you have to use the AI to create, sort of the beginning and the ending sections in which you want to couch those points, I think that's fine. But I do think that transparency is helpful. You can say, look, we can signpost, in fact, what is really the main point of what it is that we're trying to convey. Because I think otherwise what we're in is a sort of in-between world in which AI is doing quite a lot of the writing, but AI is also doing quite a lot of the reading. And what's getting lost is, what we're actually trying to say amidst the muddle of AI generated text and truly important content. Which is not to say that AI text can't be important as well, but I think the way that people are currently using it is that they're failing to distinguish between those two things. And so I think the best thing we could do is simply just to be clear with each other about what it is that we think are really needs to be retained from a particular document, and then and also be clear about what we think is sort of sections of a given report that are sort of obligatory and mandatory for various reasons that involve stakeholder communication. And I hope that we can get back to shorter reports with more content and better rates of actual engagement with that content than where we have been historically. And I think AI somewhat paradoxically can help with that.
Great, thanks for that, Josh. I think maybe just a comment here from my side, looking across all the UI and the various use cases when it comes to behavioral science. I think it's just this point of just try it until you don't know until you try. There's so many spaces it could be plugged into until you get in there. And there's so many diverse things. Colleagues work across climate, gender, health, all 193 countries. Like there's so much more we're just not we haven't identified just yet. So try it as best you can within your context and as you're able to. Okay, so there are lots of questions coming through. I might just group a couple of them, some of the higher rated questions, and we'll get some quick reactions from you all, if that's all right. So there's one question about, I guess, like inference and sort of the energy use that's involved in using AI, and to what extent should we wear that into our consideration here? And there's another question also around AI systems in both cognitive and emotional dimensions of their use. So it's not just, as Josh mentioned, writing a report and kind of cognitively getting it to a space, but there's some emotional dimensions to this as well. So curious to get your thoughts broadly on the energy side of this when we're using AI. Are there potential trade-offs? And be curious to get your thoughts on that. And then also some of the emotional dimensions of this. And we've touched upon some layers of it, but maybe just more as we pick it up, what can we think about from the emotional side? Josh, you were nodding. Did you want to go first, or at least using it?
No, to me that sounds more like an Avital question, but
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I'll start with the emotional side. And sorry, could you repeat the energy question one more time?
So it's about a bit more literally. So you can speak to a bit more how large-scale societal AI use can actually exacerbate some of the energy questions when it comes to inequalities and around the world in terms of like use and
Yeah.
the energy side of that. Yeah.
Okay, so on that front, I think that like specifically in the US, we and I think other labs do not think that like consumers should bear the energy cost of these training runs. And so it's like building behind the meter, trying to use green power whenever possible. And on the front of like the overall impact of AI, I think that you need to consider not just the use of energy for training, but also what will be the broader impact of AI on things like climate change. And I think there's a good story and a bad story. Like these AI systems do take energy to train. You can use a lot of green energy for that. but also one has to use these too for research on that front, research on clean fuels, research on carbon capture. And I think that AI systems are already being deployed for some of that. I have hopes for them to do even more in the future. So not just to exacerbate the problem, but also try to solve the problem by deploying intelligence towards that problem. Um, and then on the emotional front, I think it's funny. So, like, AI should definitely not substitute for friends or loved ones. Those are a qualitatively different thing. But people always talk about AI as if it's just IQ. But a use that I often use the AI systems for is, say I'm in a fraught interaction and I need to send back a response. The AI systems can actually be really good at being like, let's take your email and make it 10% nicer. Or I hear you that you want to say that, but that doesn't seem that constructive. Let's say something else. So they also seem to have some wisdom on that front as well. And they can be a really helpful double check for things like that. Or I think about like my mom, who's a total Luddite. She's not pro AI, but one of the times that she was most impressed with Claude was when she just entered retirement and she was talking about going through that life transition. And she opened Claude to talk about it with. And she was like, actually, that was super thoughtful and kind answers, like on par with like the best conversations I've had about this. And I found it like very helpful. So I think there is something there. It needs to be used thoughtfully. It's not a replacement, but I think they can sometimes assist with things in that area.
And just to jump in, I think, so I put it in the chat. I put a really, really good overview, the best that I've ever seen about AI in the environment. Andy Massley runs a great Substack where he collects the latest research and makes the argument that I think, you could read it for yourself. It's in the Substack. I think on the emotional front, the way that I view it is my system too in many ways. So if I need a time of I need to reflect on something, I need to think a little bit harder about something, including things like writing emails where I might be emotional or something like that. I go to the A to I open up, the system that I usually interact with, and I talk it out. And this is not replacing a therapist. This is not replacing a friend. I would not call my best friend about these things because they're busy just like me. But it's a great way to kind of slow down and think things through. And this is different from something that people are calling System 3. System 3 is cognitive offloading. This is basically saying, like, look, I don't want to think about this at all. And that's when you get things like de-skilling and things like that. But we're using it as like a kind of a symbiote for your system too is a great way of doing things. It can be unbelievably reflective and patient with you and telling you the things that you sometimes it tells you the things that you need to hear that you might not want to hear, which is always fun.
Thanks for that, Alex. There's lots there to unpack and interesting. Have another session on what is System 3 and how we can incorporate that into our behavioral thinking in the UN as well. Josh, over to you. What's your take on the energy question as well as the emotional side?
My understanding of the energy issue is that it's been somewhat debunked over the last couple of years, and that the energy costs are really not what we thought they were, and especially when you compare it to other industries. So don't have a ton to say there. Not to say that it's not something we should keep thinking about and researching, but don't have as much of a concern. I see a lot of really great questions. Let me just say, I think one question maybe just to speak to here while we have time is someone asked about whether developing countries are going to be able to catch up to to excuse me, OECD countries that are currently leading the development of the technology itself. I'm in sort of two minds about this. On the one hand, you have seen examples where, models and AI technologies that are coming out of, places where you might not expect have been able to actually catch up to a very high level of functionality very quickly. And part of that is because, they may be sort of riding the coattails, if you like, of the work being done in the frontier AI labs like Anthropic's. These labs are making huge investments that are supporting huge economic weight in large countries. But they're also doing work that is pushing the frontier forward and making it easier for others to catch up. So on the one hand, technologically speaking, it's not impossible to think that countries, firms, organizations even in the future, maybe even individuals will be able to develop their own models to serve, to serve, custom use cases that are right for them and contexts that are important for them with a very high degree of functionality. So on the one hand, I think that does become possible. On the other hand, I am quite worried that the rush to catch up is leading to some negative consequences especially in countries that haven't made the required investments that allow them to be really careful about how they roll it out. And so just as an example, I've been doing workshops over the last few months, and in certain countries in the Middle East where I go and one of the first questions I ask people, and these are workshops on behavioral science, but I have to ask people to what extent people are using AI, and I see lots of very sheepish glances, particularly among university students who believe who right now their education system has is still operating on a sort of 2022 model of delivery, and yet all the students are using AI for all their assignments. And I'm very worried that even though that will show up in terms of the rates of AI usage going up, what it's actually leading to is a dilution of the human capital that these students are supposed to be accumulating. And human capital is the bedrock of development. In no matter what a country's pathway to development is, you need to have human skills in your population in order to achieve it. And I'm very worried that the rush to develop AI is going to come from the bottom up before systems are are effectively adapting to those uses, and that you may not see the type of educational outcomes that we know are really critical for development in other areas. So I do think really important work needs to happen on that frontier in the policy community in developing countries.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Josh. Really, really important to note, and we're going to end on how we can help help increase human capability along with the advancement of AI. So with that, thank you very much to our panelists for joining us, Avital, Alex, Josh. It was a really interesting conversation. Lots of questions. Too many questions to get for this day. Was our hour with us to get today, but we can have more in the future. Lots of claps and likes. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you all soon. Okay, bye for now.